It's the Friday Cocktail, presented by Anna Glowinski.
I am joined by Sheree Bekker and Stephen Mumford to talk about their book, which is called Open Play, The Case for Feminist Sport. Now, I'm super interested in this topic because I'm a particularly sporty person, actually, and I come from a professional downhill mountain biking background, which I think has a female participation of like 3 to 5%. It's hugely male dominated. And my other latest sporting passion is I'm in a netball league, which is the other side of the coin, and it is completely female dominated. And occasionally, to make up numbers on a miserable cold Tuesday, I drag my husband and son along and get them involved, and they are the only males on the pitch. And I've also known a lot of professional athletes, male, female. I've got so many questions. I don't really know where to start, but first of all, of course, I'm just going to say hello and welcome and thank you for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having us, Anna.
Thanks. So if you could just start with telling us a little bit about yourselves and what inspired you to write this book in the first place. Maybe I've got you both on the screen, so we'll start with Sheree there.
Yeah, thank you. So, same as you, I've been interested in participating in sport all my life. I'm a swimmer, so not quite team sports, but I enjoy swimming. And I studied human movement science and sports science, and I grew up in South Africa, so I saw the power of sport, growing up in a country like that. So I've really always enjoyed sport and have been wanting to write about it for a long time. So that's how the book came about when I met Stephen.
Okay, and over to you, Stephen.
Hi there. Yes, so I'm a philosopher at Durham University, and I've been working in philosophy of sport for some time, so I've always had an interest in sport. And I also wanted to do feminist philosophy, but I kind of felt because I was a man, I couldn't really do it. But when I met Sheree and started working with her, she's got a more inclusive view of feminism, and it's given me the confidence to do a bit of work in this space. So the previous work I'd done in philosophy of sport, I don't think tackled questions of gender and gender inequality. So that's what we wanted to address in our book.
Okay, and how did you two meet? What was the connection there?
Go ahead,
well, it was sort of back in the nice days of Twitter when there was sort of academic community. We're both off it now, but there was a time in the past, believe it or not, where it was quite a nice collaborative space. You could meet people who had similar interests, but least said the better, I guess.
Now you need to go to the dark web for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so you reached out to each other on Twitter. I guess you followed each other's works, made some sort of connection. How did that then leap from chatting to undertaking this project together?
Yeah, well, this project has actually been 6 years of work together. So this was 6 years ago that we started talking. And I guess because Stephen was interested in philosophy and the philosophy of sport and feminism. And my work is very much about sport and feminist approaches to sport and sports injury prevention, particularly. So the work that I'm really known for is work on knee injuries, particularly in women athletes. So I'm sure you've heard all of these horrific statistics around ACL injuries, so anterior cruciate ligament injuries in women athletes. And so a lot of my work is about that and how gender and the environment actually causes women to have more of these injuries. So my work debunks myths that women's bodies are fragile and just prone to knee injuries. And it brings to the fore new ideas about how our environments actually make our bodies more prone to these injuries. And so these were the conversations that Stephen and I have been having for a very long time, thinking about the difference between men's sport and women's sport and why we see so many more of these injuries in women's sport. And so we've been having these conversations for 6 years now. And eventually, I guess the book emerged out of that space.
I actually had not heard that statistic about women getting more knee injuries, and I'm fascinated. And so what is your sort of bottom line conclusion then, if it's not to do with having weaker bodies?
That's right. So the real stat is that women have 2 to 10 times more knee injuries than boys and men do. Yes, that's right. And so it is a big thing that we hear about. And so if it isn't our bodies, what could it be? And for us, it really is what we're calling the gendered environment. So from the time that we're babies, little girls are treated very differently from the ways that little boys are treated. So little girls are more likely to be expected to be passive and play indoors and wear pretty dresses and not get dirty. And so their embodiment, the way that they get to know their bodies, is very different from little boys who are expected to play outdoors and rough and tumble play and play sports in which they're tackling each other and learning those bodily abilities in how to do that. And so our thinking is that kind of plays a role throughout our lifetime. And by the time we're adults playing netball, our bodies have developed in such a way that they're not as robust. And that's not just intrinsically because we're women, but because of that development over time. And then by the time that we're playing as adults, as you said, in netball, or in football or any other sports, often there isn't as much investment. Women and girls are not doing as much strength and conditioning training. Often we're worried about being perceived as being manly, and so on. And those are really our factors that play into higher rates of injury for girls and women. And we think we can do something about that and that we should change that because it's not inevitable for girls and women.
And looking at that from a more philosophical standpoint, or just your angle on this, Stephen, what do you bring to the table for this argument?
Well, yes, so my background is in philosophy, but so one thing I think is crucial in all this is we think our values should come first. So what's here is fundamentally a question of fairness and justice and equality. So we have to recognise that, most of us, we've been living in a society based on the kind of gender-based injustice. So some people use the word patriarchy for that. But what that means very concretely in sport is that men's sport is going to get 95% of the funding, the attention, all the encouragements there. And primarily, we're interested in correcting that injustice. It gives the impression that sport is not for women. There's all sorts of accusations that are put against women, especially if they're good at sport, if they're strong at sport. They face misogyny, and so there are all these barriers to women's inclusion in sport. We want to smash down those barriers. We want to sort of achieve equality in sport for men and women. But we know it's not going to be easy, but we put the values first, and that value is inclusion and equality and equity to get us there.
And to create this equality in sport, you're proposing that women's and men's sports aren't segregated. Because as I understand, they're segregated at the moment in the name of fairness. There's an assumption men will run faster, jump higher, be stronger than women. So if we want to create an inclusive competition that is competitive, we need to separate them. I believe you argue the opposite.
Yeah, so we think there are some myths, because the problem is whenever you have a segregation, it starts to create that difference and exaggerate that difference. So we draw a comparison with racial segregation, which has existed at some times and some places in the world. And all the same justifications get used, that there's a kind of intrinsic difference that they're responding to. But what we know, segregation, it reserves all the best opportunities for the group that holds the power. And so that means that though if you're in the group without the power, then you don't get the same opportunities. So that's what we think is basically going on. And there's a lot of myths here, because there are many sports that are sex segregated, and you really cannot see any possible justification for it. So there's been shooting events in the Olympics, for instance, which at one time wasn't sex segregated. And why on earth should it be? But when Zhang Shang won a gold for China in the Olympics, before the shooting event was sex segregated, it then was sex segregated.
So in our book, we trace the history of women's sport in this way, and we show how women's sport has developed as a space when women started to compete against men and started to potentially win against men, that often they then become segregated from men, as Stephen just said with Zhang Shan. So we find lots of examples of this in history where men and women competed together, but it was only when women started winning that segregation happened. And so from there, we trace what Stephen is saying about how the lack of funding and support for women's sport actually has made women less fast and less strong and so on. And so we think that there is a future, which will have to happen step by step. We couldn't do this tomorrow precisely because of these inequalities, but there is a future in which potentially sex could be sport could be desegregated, and we could all just compete against each other.
And to back that argument up, have you come across examples of perhaps different cultures where you can see that men and women are as competitively strong against each other, or cases in history where you can see that this segregation really is sort of holding women back, as opposed, you've got that sort of evidence?
Well, a nice example is the marathon, which now they separate the women's marathon in a women-only race is separated from women's marathons in a mixed race, because obviously a lot of marathons are just on roads with many competitors. But actually, women perform better when they're competing against men. So the record in a mixed race is better than the record in a woman-only race, because it's kind of, it always brings out the best in us when we're competing against stronger athletes, So it gets presented as if this is an unfair advantage, because maybe you could use a faster man as a pace setter. But it's not considered an unfair advantage if other men use a better man as a pace setter, So It's all about helping us achieve the best that we can possibly be.
And in terms of biology, I'm sure you get thrown things at you like periods. You've got a monthly cycle, which affects energy and training possibilities. Having babies, the effect of that on women's bodies. I personally know many athletes who retired after they had a baby, but also in more recent years, I've seen some very inspirational stories of women who have had babies and then gone on to stay at the top of their game. So how do you approach that topic? Because obviously that is one big biological difference between men and women, and how does that affect their performance in sport?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, we do hear that. And that is the I guess, most prominent difference that we see on an everyday day-to-day basis. But as you just said, that is changing. So as we're seeing more support for women athletes who are able to, go through a pregnancy and go back to sport postpartum, with all of that support in the world, that doesn't have to mean the end of their sporting career anymore. It doesn't mean, like we saw in the past, where women athletes lost their sponsorships when they got pregnant and so on. So we see that this is changing. And I would also say there are some sports like ultra endurance racing, where we're seeing women do amazing things. Many of the big records in ultra endurance racing are held by women at this point. And you may have heard of Jasmine Paris, who ran the Spine race here in the UK a few years ago. She was breastfeeding or pumping as she was running that race, and she beat the record, the overall record, men's and women's, by I think it was about 12 hours, and she was pumping as she was doing that race, and many people put it down to her winning down to, oh well, maybe it's just because women are better at organization or tactical things, rather than really thinking, wow, she's just an incredible woman who was able to do this and beat the men. So in our book, we look at these kind of hidden figures and these examples of where that is happening and where that is the case, just to show that it's not inevitable that women are always going to lose against men. And we're kind of excited about that, I'd say.
And then it leads... go on.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, just on the menstruation, there's a lot of research being done now on menstrual cycle in sport. But what's overlooked, men have hormone cycles as well. And we've got a slight worry that by focusing on the menstrual cycle, it's encouraging us to think of women's bodies as fragile or problematic. There's very little research done on men's hormone cycles in sport, and how that hormone cycle can affect performance of men athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm silent because I haven't heard of any men's hormone cycle research in a whole career following sport. So that is new to me. Men
have hormones. They change.
Wow. Well, there you go.
Fluctuate.
And I guess it then leads us to the biggest topic of all at the moment, which is transgender folk, non-binary, and where do they fit in to your vision? Well, I mean, I'm going to take an assumption that they fit straight into a vision for non-segregated sport in any way, shape or form. But I'd rather you put the words into my mouth and explain that better. Explain it better.
Oh, well, you say that really perfectly. You said that perfectly. For us, there really isn't any tension, and we reject these ideas that, trans inclusion is an issue around safety or fairness or these kinds of things, because we want to think about how we can categorize sport differently. So we're looking at new models for how sport can be categorized. So that's things like safety are still taken into account, and so that everybody can participate in sport safely. We think sport should be for everybody. We think, we're really interested in physical activity for health, and that's something really important for us. And so, for us, if we desegregate sport, trans people, non-binary people are very much part of that. But how we do that is, I guess, the question. And so for us, there is a long process of social justice that needs to happen to make that possible down the line. But also different models of looking at sports. So looking at weight categories, for example, or categories of maturation, for example, or even looking to the Paralympics for examples of how sports are categorized differently. And so we think that, there are some exciting new ways of doing that. Stephen, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think you've explained that well. But on the safety question, if sex is often taken as a very rough proxy for the safety, what the actual factor is that could be a threat to safety. So if it was a sport like boxing, for instance, where weight categories are very important because there is a safety issue, then sex is only very rough proxy for that. Or say in rugby. So yes, on average, maybe men weigh more than women, just on average, but it's about particular cases, and if say a big weight differential is a risk in rugby, then why isn't it divided by weight categories? Why is weight differential only a risk factor if it's including people of different sexes? If we're of the same sex, it seems rugby allows any weight differential.
And what you're proposing and your vision, it's actually quite radical because we're so used to, the Olympics, for example, covers the majority of sports and it's such a big sporting event and we're so used to seeing it segregated, men versus women. I'm interested to know how people are responding to your book, or if not to the book, this opinion that surely you floated to various bodies, various individuals over time. So let's start with sort of female and male athletes themselves. Surely you've presented this idea to those people who are in it. What's the general response that you'll get, the feedback that you get for people who get paid to do sport?
That's it. No.
If you go, Sheree, I think Stephen's frozen for a second anyway.
Run which...
sorry about that. So this is, as you say, in the current world that we're in, this is a really difficult question. Talking about trans inclusion in particular is something that many people have feelings about. And, we hear that women athletes in particular, do struggle with this. And so we've floated it in various different places and in different ways. And what we find really interesting is the examples of where it's working really well. So in sports like roller derby roller derby is not sex segregated. Roller derby is inclusive of trans women and of trans people and non-binary people. And so we're really interested in learning from those spaces. And when we do learn from those spaces, how they're doing it, what the effect is, we see that safety is not compromised there. Fairness is not compromised there. So when we share those stories with people in other sports where it seems almost impossible to do that, like, in a sport like swimming, my sport, it would seem impossible right now to have that kind of inclusion because of all of this stuff that we hear in the world about fairness and so on. But when we look at models for where that is possible and for where it is working and the benefits of inclusion for everybody, then we find that the message really is a positive one that people do pick up on in a positive way, I guess.
Fantastic. Stephen, do you have anything to add to that? Because I know you started talking at the beginning there.
Did I? Sorry, I got froze. Yeah, so we've got a research lab that we run, the Feminist Sport Lab, and we try to get various stakeholders together. But we do accept that this is, as I mentioned earlier, it's a sort of values-led project, and if our project, our value is inclusion, and we get together people who share those values. Now, I accept that there are some people at the moment who don't see things our way. And one of the things we really want to do through our book is get people to see the argument for realizing that the current arrangement doesn't really benefit women, for instance, that this separation is not operating in their benefit. So we'd really hope that people will approach our book with an open mind and, be willing to listen to the argument. And we accept it's new and it could be challenging, but please, readers, just have a look at it with an open mind. And
have you managed to have any of those conversations with perhaps some of the powers that be, the people that might be able to actually make and implement changes? I don't know, people like Sports England or FIFA or whoever.
Well, that's very much in the plan. The book's only been out for 1 week, so it might be a while before it gets us some attention. But thank you for having us on your show to give it a bit more of an airing. It's certainly, we want to get involved with the policymakers.
Yeah.
We do want them to listen to this more inclusive vision of sport. So it'd be great if anybody who heard this show were to contact us.
And do you feel, obviously you've written this book, you've done the research, do you feel ready for that? You've got a counter argument for the most common arguments, and perhaps give me some. What would you expect to be shot down with, and how would you come back against it? Because surely you can predict the sorts of things that you would be.
Well, there are a lot of myths. There are a lot of myths at the moment, for instance, that trans athletes have a sort of biologically unfair advantage. We don't see any scientific evidence for this, and we have read the papers. The most important scientific fact is, are trans athletes dominating sports in which they participate? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
They're not, because they have a very different lived experience. A trans woman is not the same as a cisgendered man. And, they're not threatening women's sport. So we just want some sense and calmness to come back into this, and we're happy to look at the scientific papers, but we do think primarily it's about our values. And if people are transphobic or misogynistic, they're not going to see the evidence that there is.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sheree, have you got anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I guess it just goes back to your earlier question, that people say, it just doesn't seem possible right now. How would we do that? Like, women would lose in all the sports right now. Women, there's this 10% gap that we see between men's and women's records. Like, women just wouldn't have a fair and equal playing field. And we do acknowledge that right now, but we say that that's not because of women's bodies or because of our biology. Again, that's because of the way that sport just doesn't support women, and how women's sport is underfunded and undersupported and so on. And so for us, we really do want to emphasize that we see this as a long project of restorative justice. We need time for women and women's sports to catch up. Women have only been allowed to participate in sport for, I don't even think it's been 100 years for most sports. So we're really on the back foot compared to men and men's sport in terms of our physicality. And so we do recognize that. Stephen and I personally would love to see desegregation tomorrow, but we also recognize that that's probably a very difficult thing to do. And so a period of restorative justice in which women can catch up, we think would be the best way to go about that.
It's a very strong argument, to be honest, very convincing point of view, as one that I've not given too much thought to in the past, apart from, as I say, the transgender question has been one that's been coming up over the last 12, 24 months or so. But to actually completely desegregate men and women's sport, I haven't thought about it in this depth before. So thank you so much for sharing your points of view with us. Thank you for sharing them with the listeners as well. I'm just checking the screen here. I'm hoping that people will message in. Maybe you've got a counterpoint of view. That's fine. We're open to anything that people want to say or want to ask about. And perhaps, obviously, Sheree and Stephen do have to go off air now, but maybe I throw them some questions and see if they can get back to me in the next hour. If anybody has anything that they'd particularly like to ask, unless you're busy. I've literally put you on the spot there, but it would be really great.
Always happy.
Yeah, it'd be really good. Thank you, Sheree. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.